Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Dariusz Wójcik. I'm the chair of FinGeo, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first FinGeo Virtual Seminar. It's the first in a series of seminars, which will run fortnightly with monthly breaks in April, August, and December. And we'll cover a wide range of topics related to financial geography in those events. We obviously live in very challenging times, but also times which generate a lot of fascinating and important questions for financial geography, including the question of what will happen to all the debt governments, businesses, and individuals are now accumulating as a result of the lockdown-induced recessions. And this takes us right to the topic of today's seminar on debt in times of the pandemic. So the seminar will be given by Shaina Potts, professor of geography and global studies at UCLA in California, US. Author of many publications on topics related to legal geography, economic geography, financial geography, among others, a contributor of a chapter on legal geographies of finance in the Routledge Handbook of Financial Geography, which just came out. And it was really a pleasure to have Shaina contributing to this volume. And I'm really grateful to Shaina for accepting our invitation to be the first presenter in our series. Before I give the floor or the platform to Shaina, I would like to thank people who co-organized this seminar with me, David Bassens, Karen Lai, Duncan Lindo, Martin Sokol, who helped publicizing it, Regional Studies Association, as part of our RSA FinGeo network, including Alex Holmes and Lisa Reynolds. So Shaina will present for about 30 minutes, after which we will have time for questions and answers. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box, Q&A box. Post your questions there, and you can start posting questions right away. I will chair the Q&A session and read out the questions that you post. So you can do it anytime. Please keep the questions coming. So with this introduction, please welcome Shaina. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Derek. Let me share my screen here. Okay. You can see my screen, Derek. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks so much for that really nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really delighted and a little bit daunted to be the first speaker in this series, which looks like it will be such a great series of talks over the next several months. So when Derek invited me to do this, he suggested that, actually encouraged me to talk about a work in progress and to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So that's what I've tried to do. And specifically what I wanted to try to do today is to connect some of the things that I've been thinking about for quite a long time to what has been happening recently in relation to sovereign debt in the global south during the pandemic. So these are sort of a mix of things I've been thinking about for a while and some more provisional observations and conclusions. And I'm really looking forward to your questions and feedback. So in addition to the astounding public health toll, the pandemic, of course, has caused massive economic dislocation all around the world. In wealthy countries, the crisis has fortunately been at least cushioned in part by sharply increasing deficit spending, often in countries' own currencies and at quite low interest rates, historically low interest rates. In low and middle income countries, in contrast, the situation has been very different. And the financial news has been full of stories like this one about South Africa. While the immediate health impacts of the virus have varied across the global south, the economic crisis is already deepening in many, many countries as a result, not just of lockdowns, but of declines in tourism, in remittances, in trade revenues, in foreign direct investment, all of which has already led to a sharp increase in unemployment, poverty, and hunger in many places. Meanwhile, both the public health and the other costs of the pandemic have been exacerbated by a deepening debt crisis in much of the global south that constrains government spending and access to new financing, while the pandemic and the associated economic crises in turn are making the debt crises in these places far worse. So my general aims today are first, just to offer a sketch of the sort of basic scope of debt burdens facing low and middle income countries. Second, to explain the only debt relief initiative to be undertaken since the pandemic started, which is the Debt Service Suspension Initiative put out by the G20. Then what I want to do is situate this initiative in a longer history of sovereign debt governance, specifically in terms of the regime for governing sovereign debt held by private commercial creditors that was set up in the 1980s. And finally, I'll discuss some of the implications of this regime for developing country debt in the context of the growing importance of private creditors generally and of China for low-income countries. So debt levels across the global south have been rising since the mid-2000s in most of Africa, Latin America, and low-income countries in Asia as well. Most of this debt is external debt, so it's from foreign creditors in foreign currencies, and it's driven in large part, the commercial creditors piling into this kind of debt have been driven in large part by the search for high yields in the context of historically low interest rates over the past decade. So this chart here shows a couple of important things. One, it just shows a rise in total debt levels for the global south since the mid-2000s, but it also shows here in the light gray and these top three bands here, a sharp rise in the relative amount of commercial creditors lending to these countries, and also, especially since 2014, a large increase in debt from China. This shift in creditor composition has contributed not only to rising total debt stocks, but to an even more rapid increase in debt service levels. And that's because commercial creditors generally and some Chinese lenders charge higher interest rates than either the Western multilateral development banks or official Western creditors. So this chart here shows the increasing debt service burden for low-income countries, growing from around 20 billion in 2015 to over 40 billion since 2019. The median interest payments among low-income countries have grown by over 128% since 2013, in contrast to about a 31% growth in government revenues. This greater exposure to commercial creditors and to Chinese creditors, and I'll come back to why I'm talking about China as a sort of separate case later on, has also exposed many of these countries to more vulnerability to financial volatility, shorter average maturities on these debts, and in some cases to collateralized loans. Meanwhile, even as debts have been rising, growth has been slowing in many emerging market and low-income economies, dragged down in part by stagnant or declining exports and by reduced commodity prices. So by 2018, well before the pandemic started, the IMF and the World Bank were already warning of looming debt distress in many countries. The pandemic has seriously exacerbated this condition. It's not only the poorest countries that are at risk. So debt burdens among the 30 biggest emerging market economies have also been rising since 2010, and they've surged since the pandemic started, as you can see here. Some countries like Saudi Arabia have even been able to sell new bonds during the pandemic at pretty good interest rates. So this has maybe will contribute to debt crises in the long run, but it has at least allowed these countries to engage in some immediate crisis-related spending. For lower income developing countries, in contrast, who have more difficulty accessing new commercial financing, even this avenue has dried up for many. So in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, bond issuances, which had soared in the past few years, dropped off sharply in 2020. All of this has created massive fiscal and financing difficulties for low and middle income countries. The World Bank estimates that about 50% of lowest income countries are at high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. An increasing number of emerging markets have entered distressed debt territory as well. At least 6 countries have already restructured or started or defaulted or restructured their debt since the pandemic began: Argentina, Belize, Lebanon, Ecuador, Suriname, and Zambia. The IMF recently concluded that the crisis will likely wipe out 10 years of progress in development in some parts of the world. So there have been a number of crisis initiatives so far. There have been emergency financing schemes through the IMF, the World Bank, and other regional development banks. The only debt relief initiative so far, the only initiative that calls for debt relief rather than just new financing has been the G20s Debt Service Suspension Initiative, or the DSSI. This has granted about $5.3 billion in debt relief to low-income countries so far. It's been loudly applauded and heavily publicized by the World Bank, the IMF, and bilateral Western creditors. Yet it has also been widely criticized, not only among debt activists, but also in the financial media for its limits. So the reason I want to focus on the Debt Service Suspension Initiative is not so much because of its importance then, but because of what I think its flaws reveal about the structural limitations of the current international sovereign debt governance regime, limitations which have been painfully illuminated by the gross insufficiency of the international response, even in the midst of this unprecedented global crisis. More specifically, focusing on the DSSI, I think helps show how creditor composition, not just total debt levels, affect sovereign debt dynamics. And that this is true not only because, for instance, different creditors charge higher interest rates, but also because of the underlying international institutional framework that governs all sovereign debt relations today. So how does the DSSI work? So basically, it's a program to offer temporary debt service deferral for payments to official G20 bilateral creditors. The G20 includes the EU, the US, the UK, Canada, China, and a handful of other countries. It was originally implemented in May 2020 through the end of 2020, and in the fall, it was extended through June 2021. It applies to 73 eligible low-income debtors. These are countries that that are eligible for international development assistance from the World Bank, plus Angola. And the estimated debt that was eligible to be written off in this way was about $11.5 billion. Debtors who take this relief are required to formally request the relief, so it's not an automatic application of this suspension. They're required to use the funds for pandemic-related response purposes and to subject themselves to IFI monitoring to ensure that they're doing this. They're also required to forego new non-concessional, so commercial lending during the suspension periods. They're not allowed to go to private credit markets during this period. So, any debt relief is good in this situation, but the DSSI has several serious flaws. The first is that it's only about debt service, not the total debt stock, and it's only deferral, not outright relief. So there's no reduction in the total principal of the debt, and even the deferred interest has to be repaid over the next 4 or 5 years once the suspension period ends. It's also very limited in the fact that it excludes middle income emerging economies, many of whom are in desperate need of debt relief. It also excludes debt owed to the World Bank itself. Most fundamentally, in my opinion, it excludes debts owed to private creditors. So the G20 governments who recognize that commercial creditor participation in debt relief is important have encouraged their own commercial lenders to participate voluntarily in this initiative. None have so far. This last point here leaves out an important proportion. The fact that it excludes commercial creditors means that a really important proportion of low-income country debt, although a proportion that varies a lot by country, is left out of the initiative, as well as some amount of Chinese-held debt, which I'll come back to later as well. So you can see the limits of all this more clearly if we look here at a breakdown of creditor composition for debt service, so for interest payments on debt for DSSI eligible countries in 2020 and 2021. For one thing, this chart here shows that the total debt service due for these countries in these 2 years is around $85 billion. Even the $11 billion eligible for relief under the DSSI then is only a very small part of that. And that's sort of this middle, some of this middle range here from Paris Club, other bilateral creditors, and some of China's debt. And the $5.4 billion that has actually been granted so far is an even more insignificant percentage of this total. These amounts are so small compared to the total amount of debt service because they don't include these bottom 2 bars of debt due to the IMF and multilateral development banks, and they don't include these top bars of commercial debt. debt owed to commercial creditors. The upshot of all of this has been that only about 46 of the 73 eligible DSSI countries have taken up the offer at all. And you can see that a breakdown regionally here. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry. So why haven't more countries taken this up? There are a number of reasons, but among the most important are the fact that the DSSI limits countries who take this relief from accepting new commercial loans, which means that for those who can still access private markets, the limited relief afforded under the DSSI is generally not seen as worth the price of foregoing more private financing during the pandemic. This is especially true for countries for whom private creditors are more important than bilateral ones. Moreover, there's already evidence that just accepting the DSSI will lead to credit downgrades from the major ratings agencies, which will make future borrowing more expensive for these countries. This fear is even more acute when it comes to even asking private creditors for deferral. The major ratings agencies have already said that even just a request for debt relief from private creditors might trigger downgrading a country's creditworthiness rating. So how should we explain the inability of the international system to respond to the looming fiscal and debt crises in the global South, even in the face of such a devastating pandemic? Now, on one level, of course, maybe this is hardly surprising in a world shaped by decades of neoliberalization and growing financial power. But what I want to suggest here is that there's also more to it than that. And in particular, I want to suggest that the limits of debt relief in the face of this pandemic today are the product of the international debt restructuring regime established in the context of the 1980s third world debt crises. Most immediately of the way that regime has privileged private contracts above all systemic considerations, and the way it has privileged the power of New York and English law in governing sovereign debt contracts, and finally, of the way it has institutionalized a sharp public-private distinction in all sovereign debt restructuring policies. Understanding why this is the case requires understanding how that international regime for governing privately held sovereign debt has worked since the 1980s. So what I'm going to offer here is a simplified sketch, but these are what I would consider basically the three key components of what is often referred to as the informal sovereign debt restructuring regime for privately held debt that we have today. So the first level of this regime is a three-tiered regime. The first level are debt contracts themselves, whether in the form of loans or bonds. And these are just contracts between debtor countries and private creditors. Now, crucially, those bonds are governed not by international law of any sort, but rather by the domestic laws of a few powerful countries. Most importantly, for low and middle income countries, this is the law of the United States and secondarily of the UK. These contracts, no matter whom they're between, so you can have a sort of French company lending to an African country, and it may be governed by a transnational extension of US common law in particular. Now, during crises, then, the third tier of this governance regime comes into play, which is that the IMF and the US Treasury lead rounds of ad hoc, sort of case-by-case negotiated debt restructurings in which debtors and creditors with IMF surveillance or supervision come to some agreement about how to restructure the debts that are in distress. Now, crucially, this regime is mandatory in practice for debtors, in large part because they simply can't get any IMF bailout loans if they don't participate in this. However, it is always and by design voluntary for all private creditors. A primary and intended effect of this, of the fact that it's voluntary for private creditors, is to allow for holdout litigation. So that is for creditors who decide not to participate in the IMF-led restructurings to sue for recovery of the full value of the debt instead, mostly in New York or London courts, so wherever the governing law is. This sort of closes the loop here and brings the debt governance back to the terms of the original contract and their enforcement by the domestic courts of a few powerful creditor countries. More generally, the possibility of holdout litigation, even when creditors don't eventually take it up, gives private creditors leverage during the IMF-led debt restructurings to push for stricter terms. So that's the sort of general institutional framework for sovereign debt governance today. Now, the logic of this three-part framework depends on the repeated deployment of a sharp politics economics or public-private distinction. And I want to sort of show you how that works. So specifically, discourses about sovereign debt governance constantly separate the relevant institutions into two categories. On the one hand, there are a set of institutions associated with being political, public, sort of state-based and mandatory. And on the other hand, a set of institutions that are defined as apolitical or technical, private, market-based, and voluntary. On the left-hand side here, there's law in general, but specifically legislation or statutes is put in this category. At the international level, this applies to binding international rules, and most importantly, the UN regulations and the UN General Assembly in particular are kind of put in this category. All of these are classified and criticized as being too political and sort of too mandatory or binding in standard sovereign debt governance discussions. On the other side then, and contrasted sort of at each step in this institutional hierarchy, are contracts and common law, both of which are seen as preferable to state-based legislation for governing sovereign debt. These are defined as apolitical, technical, and even in the case of common law, which is still law, as being more private and sort of more akin to market-based, more supportive of market-based transformations than statutes. At the transnational level, the extension of transnational domestic law, like US law, is the sort of preferred mode of governance. And if it must go to international institutions of some sort, then the IMF is seen as the institution of choice. The IMF is framed in these conversations, although not in all conversations, as being a kind of technical institution that offers apolitical advice to debtor governments and to creditors, and allows them to engage in a purely voluntary way in sovereign debt governance. Now, of course, to be clear, every institution on this list is in fact shot through with state power in all kinds of ways. But the logic of these framings, of this sharp distinction between the political and the public on the one hand and the apolitical and the private on the other, is deployed at each scale to undergird the current contract common law IMF debt system in place today. Furthermore, I would suggest that this framing not only reflects dominant neoliberal rhetoric about the separation of states and markets, but more importantly, and we're thinking about Polanyi here, that it has been a key site for institutionalizing this dichotomy within each institutional scale and also across institutional scales. This existing sovereign debt restructuring system then, which is used to exempt private creditors from any required debt restructuring or relief, has limited all significant debt relief initiatives since the 1980s. It was established with strong support from the United States and generally from all major Western governments, and it continues to be supported by them in general, even when it occasionally hampers the desires of those governments themselves, as for example now in the DSSI case, when I think most of these creditor governments would actually like their commercial creditors to participate in debt relief in the context of the pandemic. So in the rest of the talk, what I want to do is just highlight three concrete effects of this system for sovereign debt relief generally and relief under the pandemic in particular. So first, the power of these joint discursive and institutional mechanisms that I've just laid out can be seen in the failure of every attempt to replace the current three-tiered sovereign debt governance system with a binding international restructuring framework. I won't go into the details of these, but I'm happy to talk about them more in the Q&A, but this includes most famously the IMF's own 2001 proposal for sovereign debt restructuring, for a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, which would have been binding on creditors and debtors and would have been housed at and run by the IMF. It also includes a 2014 UN General Assembly resolution calling for a multilateral legal framework for debt restructuring. This resolution passed in the General Assembly by 124 to 11, but it went nowhere, largely because of a failure to, a lack of support and a failure to participate by any major Western country. Both of these efforts were defeated by the private sector and by creditor country official opposition. And in both cases, the arguments used against these were made in the language of these sharp splits between a sort of supposed state-based response on the one hand and market-based response on the other, and on the grounds that any kind of binding mechanism would interfere with a supposedly self-regulating sovereign debt market. Meanwhile, in addition to interfering with any attempt to replace this system with a binding international framework, the current framework has also actually enabled a shift towards harsher and stricter debt restructurings over time. And this is despite massive institutional efforts by the IMF and the World Bank and other agencies devoted to overseeing debt negotiations and to trying to produce best practices and contractual shifts in bonds that are supposed to make it harder for creditors in the meantime. Why have debt restructurings on the whole gotten harder? On the one hand, this has to do with growing creditor diversity and coordination problems. So the shift from bank loans to a larger proportion of sovereign debt being taken out in bonds has meant that there's a much larger number of players on the creditor side, and that's made coordination difficult. But it also has to do more specifically with legal changes, in particular in US law since the 1980s, that have bolstered the position of holdout creditors. Major holdout successes against Greece and Argentina in the 2010s, building in large part on these legal changes, have also further emboldened creditors. And there are recent reports that even creditors who in the past would probably have accepted more traditional restructurings have taken these successes against Greece and Argentina as a sign that the holdout model might pay off, and that they're more likely to participate in or to engage in this kind of holdout litigation. All of this has enabled generally an increasing specialization in distressed debt trading. And we've seen that just in the last several months as distressed debt funds have piled into low-income COVID-hit countries in emerging market and some lower-income COVID-hit countries because they see that there are possibilities for really significant gains in the future as the prices of those bonds have dropped. Finally, the last point I want to make here, and a bit more provisionally, the DSSI has also highlighted the way that China is now taking advantage of this existing sovereign debt governance framework, including of the way that the public-private distinction has been deployed within it. So China has become an increasingly important global creditor in the last decade. As you can see in this graph here, it is now the largest official creditor to low-income countries, outlending all Paris Club governments together by a significant amount, and even outlending the World Bank in recent years. In terms of the total debt stock of emerging market and low-income economies, China holds about 1/6 of that total debt stock. It holds about 1/5 of the total debt stock of all African DSSI eligible countries. So China is a really major player here. Debt service to China accounts for over 25% of all debt service owed by DSSI eligible countries in both 2020 and 2021. So all of this, of course, makes China an extremely important player in any widespread debt relief effort. And in fact, China has been an important participant in the DSSI. This is the first time China has participated in this kind of multilateral debt restructuring initiative. China has actually granted about half of the $5.4 billion in debt relief so far dispersed under the initiative. However, China and the World Bank have also been fighting over how to characterize some of China's lenders. As you can see here in this chart, where after Chinese commercial banks and Chinese official bilateral creditors, it says in parentheses, World Bank definition. So China has deferred payment on debt held by its Export-Import Bank, which China agrees is an official lender. The rest of the debt held by China is held by some banks that the World Bank agrees with China are commercial. And then a big chunk of this debt is held by the China Development Bank. And it's the China Development Bank that is the focus of this definitional dispute between the World Bank and China. So the China Development Bank lending is only significant for some DSSI countries. It's not important for a number of them, but it's extremely important for others, most importantly, Angola. The World Bank insists that the CDB is an official creditor and that therefore the debts that it holds, or debt service on the debts it holds, should be waived under the DSSI. China insists that the CDB is actually a commercial bank and that it will encourage the CDB to offer debt relief, just like the Paris Club is encouraging its private creditors to do, which is to say with no chance of succeeding whatsoever. So my point here isn't to weigh in on whether or not the CDB is really public or private. Rather, the CDB is in fact a hybrid institution that I think could arguably be defined either way, and we could talk more about that. But what I want to emphasize rather here is that this distinction between public and private creditors, the fact that this distinction can be struggled over and strategically deployed in these sovereign debt governance disputes is only possible because of the way the current three-tiered sovereign debt restructuring system set up in the 1980s insists on strictly voluntary participation by all private creditors. As China has become an increasingly important player in the world economy, and as it radically expands lending across the global South, including in ways that the US government and the Bretton Woods institutions see as quite threatening, China is taking advantage of the institutions that the US and the Bretton Woods institutions themselves established. So to sum up, debt levels in low and middle income countries were already rising before the pandemic. Since the pandemic began, debt service payments and limits on financing options have severely restricted the ability of these countries to respond to both the health and economic crises they're facing in the way that wealthy countries have been able to. Although some new emergency financing has been extended by the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, the failure to offer any real debt relief, especially when it comes to private creditors, will undoubtedly increase the severity of both the immediate public health crisis and of the economic damage to come. Even as vaccines, themselves less accessible to low-income countries, allow a gradual return to normal life in some places over the next few years, this will continue to be the case. So the main point that I wanted to make today is that this failure is rooted not only in a kind of general bias towards creditors and contract rights, but also in the inherent institutional limits of the existing international framework for restructuring sovereign debt. Without a massive overhaul, and I would argue specifically without an international framework that is binding on all private creditors and on all existing debt contracts, significant debt relief for lower income countries will be impossible, and the COVID pandemic will trap countries in vicious cycles of debt that both impede their ability to deal with the immediate crisis and limit their possibilities for future recovery. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Shaina. Wonderful presentation. Hugely significant topic, globally significant. We have a large number of questions in the Q&A box, and everyone is welcome to keep adding to this box. So I'll just get straight to it, starting from the top, and I will read the questions quickly, and you can look at them, Shaina, as well. Some questions, quite elaborate questions. Thank you very much for engaging so much with the presentation, everyone. So James Camilleri is asking, who are the commercial creditors? Can you give some examples of leading actors?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge range, so it's hard to do. So in the 1970s and 1980s, the primary commercial creditors were large financial banks in New York, London, and other parts of Europe in particular. Since then, it's really proliferated. So all the major investment banks are still involved in this kind of lending and are pretty big players here. But there have also been a proliferation of hedge funds, of all sorts that have increasingly engaged in this kind of debt. Retail investors, so sort of pension funds and sort of small investors have also become quite important players in the bond markets in particular as well. Bonds are much easier to trade than loans, so there's a huge secondary market in bond trading. So really since the 1980s, there's been an explosion of boutique investment firms of all kinds participating in this kind of sovereign debt lending and trading.
Another question, in terms of elaboration, can you say more about the failed reform efforts from Mia Gray?
Yeah, I can say a little bit more. So, I mean, so there have been these two major reform efforts. The one that gets a lot more attention in sort of mainstream conversations about sovereign debt is the IMF's SDRM, sovereign debt restructuring mechanism proposal from 2001. So the head of the IMF at the time, Anne Kruger, actually made this proposal for a binding institutional mechanism that would be housed at the IMF. It was critiqued by debt activists for putting the IMF at the center of this, the IMF itself being quite a powerful creditor, of course, in this, but it would have given the IMF the ability to impose restructurings on private creditors. It was shot down basically by huge outcry from the financial sector and from the US government, as well as most other major creditor countries. Some emerging market countries like Mexico, for instance, criticized it as well on the grounds that they thought it might increase their interest rates in private commercial markets, that it might lead commercial creditors to refuse to lend except at higher interest rates. So it basically was scrapped by around 2003. And what happened instead was that the IMF sort of used the failure of that to get private creditors to agree to a bunch of contractual changes in new sovereign debt contracts, in particular, something called collective action clauses, which are designed to make it a bit easier for a majority of creditors to push through a restructuring even against the wishes of a few holdouts. So basically, if you get 75% of the holders of one particular bond issuance to agree to a restructuring, the other 25% have to accept it. So, so those have helped to some extent in some recent restructurings. But since 2003, basically the IMF has pursued only these market-based approaches.
Mm-hmm. And another big question, Shaina, from Iji Blazek, after the current peak in debt, do you expect a return to strict monetary policy in developed countries or a new normal? With acknowledgement that high debt is normal?
Yeah, yeah, great question. I mean, obviously, there's huge debates about this right now, and I don't know if I have any particular wisdom here. I think it's a positive sign that there have been such open public conversations in many of the major wealthy countries about the benefits of stimulus versus austerity, and that hopefully some of that will continue past the pandemic. The IMF is actually itself currently encouraging both wealthy countries and developing countries to engage in much more stimulus spending than the IMF has traditionally done in the past. So that's an interesting development as well. Yeah, so hopefully, but I'm not sure. Yes,
and Eric Shepard is asking about the map of risk analysis prior to 2020.
Great, thanks, Eric. Yeah, so as I mentioned in the talk, debt levels have been rising significantly in both sort of emerging market economies and lower income countries since the mid 2000s, really, continuing and then sort of increasingly after 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, and continuing through the 2010s. That was driven, as I mentioned, in large part because of sort of years of quantitative easing and very low interest rates driving financial sector investors to sort of the search for high yields, which is to say higher interest debts in the global south. So it was already looking precarious for the World Bank estimates for about half of low-income countries already by about 2018. At the same time, many countries that were able to make those debt payments and would have been able to continue making debt payments had the pandemic not happened, were sort of thrown into crisis by the pandemic. Yeah.
All right. Also, there is a question whether you've looked at debt of private households and how it relates to the question of sovereign debt.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I personally haven't done that much. Of course, private household debt is growing as well in many economies, including the United States and the UK. And there is an important connection between rising private household debt levels and sovereign financing, sovereign finances, I should say. Of course, in this because when governments are unable to spend on their citizens, when governments are unable to provide services, then it sort of gets the responsibility for that gets passed on to households who end up spending a lot more on their own debt service. But beyond that, I don't know. I haven't looked personally into the details of that relationship in the pandemic.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I'm so impressed by the pace at which you are able to answer questions, and thank you everyone for asking questions. So I'll just keep going because they're all fascinating. Lou Miller asks, you mentioned the US legal changes since the 80s, that these changes have supported holdout creditors. And Lou Miller is asking whether you can give an example.
Yeah, thank you. And I think part of your comment is that I'm talking really fast, so I'll try to slow down a little bit. So I'll name three particular changes, legal changes in US law that really bolstered the position of holdout litigators since the 1980s or 1970s. So first in 1976, the US and the UK around the same time passed legislation changing foreign sovereign immunity rules, specifically to make a commercial exception to foreign sovereign immunity law. So foreign sovereign immunity laws had protected sovereign governments from being sued in the courts of other countries. In the 1970s, the US, the UK, and then increasingly other governments enacted commercial exceptions to those rules. This mattered for sovereign debt, actually not immediately, but then about 10 years later, when the US Supreme Court held that issuing sovereign debt is a commercial act, not a government act. So the government, the US Supreme Court held in 1992 that issuing sovereign debt, because companies can issue debt as well, is basically just a commercial market act, and therefore that countries are not immune from lawsuits in sovereign debt cases. Another really important legal change in the context of the 1980s debt crises and some of the earliest holdout litigation in US courts against third world sovereign debtors at that time was that initially some courts in New York said, well, actually, we're not going to rule against the creditors here against the debtors here because the debtors are participating in IMF restructuring programs. They're participating in these US-led debt relief efforts. And we want to encourage US policy on debt relief. The US government at the time in 1985 stepped in and actually convinced the Second Circuit Court in New York to overturn that ruling, basically saying, actually, the court was wrong about US policy, and under US official policy was that private contract rights were more important than these sort of multilateral debt relief initiatives. So that sort of shifted the all of the future litigation there. And then finally, in the mid to late 1990s, something called the Champerty Doctrine, which had actually banned, with limited or varying success over the last several decades, the kinds of intentional distressed debt litigation that a number of hedge funds now specialize in. This had banned in US law any person from intentionally buying distressed debt in order to sue for recovery. That Champerty Doctrine with a lot of lobbying from hedge funds like Elliott, who's been a really big player in all of this, was overturned in New York State law and sort of crossed off the books. So those three things in particular really opened the way for this kind of holdout litigation.
Thank you. And David Bassens says that you're drawing a bleak story from the perspective of debtor countries. Is there any evidence, though, that the crisis could become a creditor countries crisis through the exposure to this debt? So another broad question about the implications.
You mean, so if there were sort of major defaults on this debt, could that end up sort of bleeding over into creditor countries? Yeah, it's a good question. I'm skeptical that it would cause a real systemic crisis for creditor countries. It would certainly probably hurt a number of private banks and hedge funds. The big investment banks as far as I know, don't have big enough exposure. So unlike in the early 1980s, when the biggest Wall Street banks had such massive exposures to developing country debt that had the debt just been written off all at once, there would have actually been probably a massive banking crisis on Wall Street. The major investment banks now, as far as I know, don't have that level of exposure. It might wipe out a number of hedge funds who are participating in this kind of debt, and some small retail investors as well. But I don't think it's likely, although that certainly is one of the sort of specters that private financiers will raise in their argument against outright debt relief.
Thank you. Duncan Lindo did a lot of work co-organizing this seminar with us. So I think it's only right that I also read his question for you, Shaina. So he's saying, assuming no increased fiscal space is created and private creditors don't participate, then any debt relief from governments is effectively a subsidy to private financial firms. So could it be that this is what core country governments and financial firms want? They want this kind of subsidy for private firms to happen.
That's a great question. So absolutely, and that's been one of the big concerns about the DSSI and really about any debt relief initiative that does not include private creditors, is that means that the money saved in that debt relief effort is often just sort of being funneled directly to creditors that are still collecting interest payments. I'm certainly not. I wouldn't say that it's impossible that that's what creditor country governments want, although I guess I don't see any particular evidence to be quite that cynical in this case about it. In fact, the IMF and the World Bank have been very adamant, and that's one of the reasons why they say that these countries have to engage in IFI surveillance or monitoring of how they spend the money saved in this initiative, is precisely because they're insisting that that money has to be spent on public health or other sorts of direct measures rather than on paying commercial creditors. Now, of course, I mean, whether or not that means it frees up some other money in the budget to go to those commercial creditors, that gets pretty hard to track. I will say that just generally, all of the creditors involved here frequently use a term called sort of creditor comparability of treatment, right? So they're all very concerned about whether another creditor is getting a better deal than they are, and they all sort of refuse in general to participate in restructurings where they don't feel certain that, as they put it, other creditors are having to take the same kinds of haircut. So the private creditors are quite worried that they might have to take more of a haircut than China, for instance. So it's possible, but I'm not sure it's a real scheme by the creditor country governments to sort of subsidize the private sector.
And just to add to the diversity of questions, I would like to choose one from Aman Banerjee, asking about the role of transnational social movements, whether they can play any role in challenging this international debt regime. So have there been more recent variations of events like Seattle 99 that you see as having any potential for challenging the global debt regime in this current context?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm not an expert on these social movements. Certainly, I think transnational social movements in the late 90s and early 2000s and the kind of pressure that they were putting on the IMF and the World Bank were really critical in leading to what ended up becoming the HIPC and the MDRI initiatives in which the Bretton Woods institutions did forgive a substantial amount of debt for the lowest income countries in the world. And I think it's clear that the way the IMF and the World Bank have continually adjusted their rhetoric, but also some of their practices on sort of what kinds of policies to encourage and what sorts of terms and so on, has been influenced by the critiques of these kinds of social movements over time. There are definitely debt activist groups, I think in all of these countries. Some of them are coordinated through things like the Jubilee Debt Campaign. There's a sort of Jubilee USA and a Jubilee Debt Campaign based in the UK that does some sort of linking of these kinds of debt activist groups. But I don't know of any clear evidence of sort of specific victories, I guess, in the last several years, although I think it's really important to have that kind of pressure.
Excellent. And there is a cluster of questions, a group of questions concerning the role of China, which you raised. For example, Ulysses Pascal asking about whether China has taken advantage of the situation. And there are a couple of other questions to this effect. And also on this Chinese theme, Eric Shepard asking about the role of the AIIB and the Belt and Road Initiative and how it's related to what we see happening over the last year in terms of the role of China as a creditor in these relations.
Great. Yeah, well, maybe I'll just try to say, and and I guess the China part here is the newest part for me. So I'm really not an expert on China, although I think it's really interesting what's happening here. But a few things I would say is that China lends at sort of 3 different tiers. They do a small amount of zero interest lending. So, I guess very concessional, no interest, but it's about 5% of their total lending, and they seem to use that sort of strategically, to sort of garner goodwill in certain places, and and maybe for less felicitous ends. But then they do engage to the Export-Import Bank in China in a large amount of kind of concessional lending. From what I understand, this tends to be on terms that are not quite as concessional, so slightly higher interest rates and shorter maturities than the World Bank, but sort of roughly in the ballpark of World Bank concessional lending rates. And then they have a bunch like the China Development Bank, which, although it is run by the Chinese government, engages in for-profit market rate lending. These Chinese loans, are used in large part to finance infrastructure projects, including infrastructure that's directly related to the Belt and Road Initiative. So, of course, China is both sort of lending to certain countries and kind of directing that money to these infrastructure projects that are beneficial for this bigger Chinese project as well. They have engaged on their concessional and commercial credit. They've engaged in debt restructurings in sort of similar ways as Western creditors have. So, which is to say, they've refused to give outright debt relief, but they've engaged in ad hoc negotiations and restructured some of that debt in the past. So sort of from the outside, I'd say it looks sort of similar to what Western countries are doing in terms of how they treat those loans. The Chinese commercial loans have about market rates. I mean, I haven't seen any evidence that they really have higher interest rates than Western commercial loans. However, they are often collateralized, and that's been a source of concern. So they're sometimes collateralized with major infrastructure projects. So for Laos, for instance, had a loan that for which the utility network that the loan was used to build was collateral. And when Laos couldn't repay the loan, China took over that utility network. The AIIB, I think, is clearly trying to set itself up as an alternative to the World Bank and other Western multilateral development banks. I haven't seen, even though we have a student at UCLA who's working on this, I haven't seen any direct evidence, in part because I think it's been hard to get, and they haven't made that many loans yet, of exactly what the terms or conditionalities on those will be. But the suggestion that China is making is that it won't have the kinds of neoliberal policy conditionalities that the IMF and the World Bank have attached to them, although it very well may have other sorts of pressures attached.
Excellent. And further on China, there are questions about the geopolitical implications of this situation and the role of China in this as a creditor nation and in debt relief. So Will Bratton asking whether you think this creates pressures to reform the Bretton Woods institutions to allow a different role for China in the global financial system.
Yeah, I mean, I think it must be, although again, I'm not an expert on exactly how they're responding to this, but I think certainly the IMF, the World Bank have been vocally criticizing China for not including all of its official debt, according to the World Bank definition, in this initiative. They've sort of, in their official rhetoric, been applauding the fact that China is becoming a more active lender in making these kinds of development loans. But yes, I think there's sort of now a sort of contest between the World Bank and China over sort of who can offer the sweeter deal, based on different sorts of criteria to developing countries. And I imagine that people at the World Bank and the IMF are quite concerned about the growing about the growing prevalence of Chinese loans in these places. But I don't know in more detail how exactly internally how the World Bank is trying to respond to that. Interestingly, in this particular case, China's retort to the World Bank's criticisms of it not including the China Development Bank has been that to encourage the World Bank to include its own debts in the initiative, right, which the World Bank has refused to do. The World Bank and the IMF generally do not include their own debt in these sorts of debt relief initiatives. Their argument for that is that they need extremely high credit ratings in order to be able to access low interest financing on international credit markets so that they can use those low interest loans to make their concessional loans to other countries.
Excellent. And I think as we're moving towards the last few minutes, I think I will choose a question from Alan Paul asking whether there have been any discussions about a complete debt forgiveness along the lines of a biblical jubilee. As you said, these arrangements have been rather limited and quite stingy, arguably. So anything more ambitious being discussed or debated?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, by debt activists, absolutely. And so there are a lot of debt activists who have been calling for Jubilee for a long time, and not just in a sort of general sense even, but with very specific plans for how you could arrange that, how you could do debt audits to sort of make a distinction between legitimate and illegitimate debts, you know, how you could cancel certain debts in the face of certain kinds of emergency situations. So there are a number of proposals for how widespread debt relief could be organized. None of them, I would say, have real traction within the major lending institutions or creditor countries. You know, I think it's really important that those conversations keep happening. I think that sort of the most ambitious proposal on the table right now, which was shot down by the Trump administration, was not for debt relief, but rather for the IMF to create $1 trillion in new special drawing rights. Special drawing rights are a kind of like cross between a currency and a credit. The IMF refers to them as a unit of account. They have to be exchanged for other currencies like dollars, but the IMF could just, like any central bank, can just create that, and actually did create about $200 billion in response to the global financial crisis. So there have been calls, including at pretty high policy levels, for the IMF to do something like that now. But that we'll see if the Biden administration is more favorable towards that.
Exactly. And I think this optimistic note is an appropriate one on which we could finish the Q&A session. Before I say a few words, Shaina, would you like to add anything?
No, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated this. It was great to have a chance to talk through some of these things that I'm just thinking about and to think about your questions. And thanks again for inviting me, Derek.
Thank you, Shaina. And we're extremely grateful. It's been a wonderful session, which has obviously generated a lot of questions. I apologize to people whose questions I didn't have time to read, but I'm sure Shaina has seen these questions and can look at them again. I have a few questions I didn't ask myself because we didn't have time. And we've had great participation here with nearly 60 people, 60 participants at some point. So this is really great to see, very encouraging for us at FinGeo, because with these seminars, we really wanted not to just add to your Zoom activities, but actually create a kind of a sense of a global community of people interested in these topics and help us stay in touch with each other. So thank you, Shaina, for a wonderful presentation. Next FinGeo virtual seminar takes place in 2 weeks' time on the 16th of February, 1 p.m. GMT, by Vladimir Pajitka, the winner of the 2019 FinGeo Dissertation Prize. So I hope to see many of you there. Again, many thanks to my co-organizers, including Karen Lai, David Bassens, and Duncan Lindo, and the Regional Studies Association for hosting us. Thank you. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you.